Lewis Hamilton, a beautiful pole position for the sprint race here in Shanghai in China. Lewis Hamilton being a tight line merchant. If you've been following the channel, you know exactly what I'm talking about. China having a lot of long corners, a lot of track width as well. Lewis Hamilton will thrive in this type of environment. And it was really interesting to see him get on top of Charles Leclerc in the sprint in race 2. I thought it was going to happen at some point in the season, but not this early. So I'm quite surprised to see that. If you're interested in the full practice SQ1, SQ2, and SQ3 analysis, definitely keep watching. Welcome back to the channel, guys. My name is Martin. I'm a specialist technical coach and mentor for open formula drivers. Let's kick off with practice. Initially, it was very low grip track conditions. Now, we spoke in our live stream, the track was going to be resurfaced, and this is typical of newly resurfaced tracks because they've got that oil coming to the surface, and eventually it dries out. It might not dry out completely this weekend. This is something that sometimes takes years to kind of just, you know, settle down and give a bit of consistency. So that's typical. And there were a lot of drivers off in this session. Therefore, turn 1, again, we spoke about on the live stream just how technical that corner is. Long corner, decreasing radius, flat on the way in where front grip is a challenge, trail braking as you get further around the corner. And then again, once you're totally off the brakes, front grip again for the third part of the corner. So we spoke about that and it had its challenges. A lot of drivers locking the rears into that corner. So we'll talk to that. For example, the first person we saw off was in the first 5 minutes, Alex Albon. Not sure if locking the rears, but certainly overloading the rear tires in that sort of second to third phase of that corner. He was the first one that struggled in turn 1. Then we saw a bunch of other drivers struggle into there as well. We saw Liam Lawson with the back stepping out. We saw Max Verstappen with the back stepping out again towards the later stages, later phases of that corner in the Red Bull. Max taking his usual slightly wider entries, which is typical of Max, trying to carry as much speed as he can into the corner. But the downside and downstream implication of that is overloading the rear tires. It was interesting to see that like we said on the live stream, I'm looking for this to be a driver's session, not touch the setup too much, play with the driver tools. Therefore, in a corner like that, when you know that the lockup or unloading of the rear is happening later in that phase of the corner, you know you need to migrate your brake balance forward, therefore, which is very unusual. Typically in a decreasing radius corner, you would not migrate your brake balance forward. But in this particular example, no one was getting lockups on the initial contact. It was happening later, and that's where the brake migration is a thing. Obviously, you can control it with the brake pressure, using the gears more, pulling back. But I just wanted to highlight to you that this was low grip conditions, a lot of drivers struggling into turn 1. The cars are very heavy in the rear, particularly if they've got a lot of fuel in them. It's easy for that weight and momentum to just, the rear to just overcome the front. And that's what we saw happening down there at turn 1. It was really interesting to see Lewis Hamilton lose the rear on the entry to the hairpin. We spoke about hairpins yesterday in the live stream, just how straight line braking they are, how the brake balance goes forward, how tight this corner is. And the fact that he lost the rear on the entry there is telling about his style and technique. We spoke extensively about Lewis on this channel, how he likes to attack his entries, number 1, and he needs a stable rear, first and foremost, number 2. Just the amount of speed he carries into the corner and the way he approaches the corner, the whole combination of brake release and steering introduction means that Lewis is more rear, like prone to losing the rear than he will the front. And that's what we saw happen into the hairpin. Now, 1 lap later, he totally cleaned it up and nailed it without making any changes to his steering wheel. Now, I know he didn't make any changes to his steering wheel because later in the session, his race engineer gives him some instructions and some directive for changes to the steering wheel into that corner. So that's really insightful because it tells me, confirms to us how Lewis approaches, how he attacks his entries. It confirms to us that he's not a big changer of the buttons on the steering wheel. He won't do a Nico Rosberg and start to leverage tools. I would be doing this, start to leverage driver tools immediately and start to iron out and clean up some of these inconsistencies, whether that's brake balance, engine braking, differential at entry, mid, exit, brake migration, brake shape, and so on. You've got so many tools. I think these should come first and foremost before we start to look at car setup changes. And that's why I said yesterday in the live stream, this is a driver's session where the drivers have just got to get used to what they have. So So it was really interesting to see them. Oscar's engineer 15 minutes into the session phone up Oscar and say, hey, how's the car feeling? Do you want to make any changes? And I'm like, it's 15 minutes into a session on a brand new track that's just been resurfaced, where everyone's struggling with balance, whether that be lockups, oversteer, understeer, braking to, like, everyone's struggling for traction. There's a bunch of issues out there, not necessarily car setup related, just the function of the track conditions, track grip, and driver tools. And they're trying to dial themselves in this session. So I thought by Oscar's engineer phoning him to ask him how the car feels is directionally incorrect. The car should not be the focus of the session, rather getting the driver comfortable with what they have and just setting up driver tools like we mentioned. So then 24 minutes into the session, Lewis gets a message from his race engineer, Ricky. Hey, Lewis, turn 14, BB61, that's brake balance 61% to the front, which is a pretty big brake balance on the front. And then BMIG5, I don't know how they map their brake migration, but brake migration number 5. Now, typically how these would work, if I can give you an insight, is you would, let's say, start the brake balance less far forward and then migrate forwards, or you would start the brake balance really far forward, in this case 61, and migrate rearwards. You've either got a problem on the initial contact or you've got a problem later in the braking phase. All these guys that locked up at turn 1 and Lewis into the hairpin was later in the braking phase. So it speaks more to the migration. Where's that brake balance shifting as that corner unfolds and as the driver comes out and trail brakes out of the brake pedal? BB61 is a very far forward brake balance. I'm assuming they're migrating it towards the rear, and if they are, that would be incorrect. Lewis needs something that's going to migrate forwards into that corner. That's what I believe, because he's already asking so much from the rear of the car. The last thing he needs is rear migration into the hairpin. Lando had a big snap on the entry into turn 1. We've spoken at length again about the McLaren's front grip and its ability to just pull the front of the car, sometimes being too strong. We saw in Bahrain it was too strong on day 3. And that big snap on the entry to turn 1, he's flat and just turning. That's enough for the front to just overcome and overload the rear. So this was a driver's session, guys. This is right up my alley. This is what I love. Like, when it's not about, who's got the most data and most information, it's about continuous and quick iteration, being able to problem solve out there. And if you've seen my video, I think it's in the linked in the description of this one. It's entitled How to Drive Like a Machine. And it's all about iteration, problem solving, quick changes, and understanding phases of the corner so that you can quickly put those fires out and just move forward super quickly. I'm not sure who did that the best, to be honest. Maybe George did well in that area. Maybe Lando did it that well as well. I'm not sure, to be honest. I'll need to go over the data and have a look at, how their lap times progressed. But that's what you're looking for. A lot of drivers made mistakes out there, which is fine. We spoke again about this not being a street circuit, therefore the street circuit rule not applying. Do your lockups, run deep, slide the rear, give the traction a go. Like, it's going to be all about that learning, because there's no consequence. There's big runoff areas in China. There's not really consequence for error. So the street circuit rule doesn't apply. I thought I'd call that out as well. Interesting that Charles Leclerc lost the rear quite heavily and quite badly into turn 1. I've mentioned Charles Leclerc struggles with decreasing radius corners, and I'll bring it up now. I think we spoke about this in 2024. And it was in a decreasing radius corner, crucially. So we're just going to jot that down because I'm going to refer back to it when we talk about more unforced errors. So decreasing radius corner, obviously where you're braking and downshifting at the same time and the corner gets tighter. And Charles has lost the rear on entry here and just slid the car into the wall. Again, another decreasing radius corner. Here he's just come over this curb and he's lost the rear. It just goes to show that how powerful the framework of the 7 technical corners is. In and of itself, they're not new definitions of corners. Corners have been around since the beginning of time almost. But that framework of the 7 technical corners allows you to set up the car in a certain way, or if the McLaren's got a lot of front grip, that that's going to help in a certain type of corner. Or if you've got a driver struggle, like I think maybe Leclerc does in decreasing radius corners, you can address that issue. It's like in tennis, you've got your shots, forehand, backhand, volley, slice, serve, overhead. We're really pinpointing one of the areas here as if it was work on your forehands. And this is what I'll be saying to Charles, work on your decreasing radius corners. The only thing I can think that it would be, because the line looks fine and the steering looks fine, I think it's too much initial braking and that initial contact where it steps out the rear for Charles. Without having all of the data, all of the information, I'm not sure. We don't get access to the brake pressure and the GPS for the line as well. So I think it would be that, all things being equal in terms of steering. I think it's in the braking somehow. Interesting to see Antonelli come on the radio and say, my left front is totally dead, guys. Now, he was struggling from blistering, which surprises me, actually. At this point, I just want to differentiate between blistering and graining. And it's got to do with the difference in temperature between core and surface. So graining is hot surface and relatively cooler core temperature of the tire. So you get that sort of surface graining similar to an eraser or rubber. When you rub that on a piece of paper, that's just the surface balling up and graining. That can clean up when the temperatures equalize. So if you've got hot surface for graining and lower core temperature, eventually that core temperature can come up and meet the surface temperature and the graining will clean up. Blistering is the opposite. Blistering is eruptions from the inside out. It's the core temperature hotter than the surface temperature, like volcanic eruptions. Generally a sign that the car's not sliding, because it's obviously enough to generate core temperature, but it's just overheating for some reason. So whether that's too high pressure, too much load, it's doing too much work, basically. And that's something that won't clean up and is going to get worse. Now, how can you drive around these issues, both of these issues, because they are overheating of the tire in some way, shape or form? It's the tight line. The tight line into turn one is probably the only opportunity on the track where you can look after the left front, and the tight line is going to be the most powerful lever that you can pull. In addition to all the setup changes, front wing, front roll bar, tire pressure, everything, the line is going to be the biggest lever that you can pull. And if Kimi can learn that already and start to drive a tight line and look after the left front, it will pay you back in spades in the race, that I can promise you. Now, look, we saw towards the end of the session a lot of light fuel running on the soft compound tire, not much running on the medium compound tire. I did recommend that yesterday that the guys do a bit of light fuel running on the medium compound tire and work out and understand that, because you've only got one shot in SQ1 and SQ2, and you're going to have to use that medium tire. That's arguably more important than what happens in SQ3 if you get into SQ3, right? So that's what I'm trying to say there, is they should do a little bit more practicing on the just how that medium performs over one lap, and you're going to find out how it performs in the race anyway with the sprint. I just feel like qualifying's a lot more important for the sprint than the sprint itself, if that makes sense. I feel like sprint weekends are just a step-by-step. Practice should, in my opinion, should be ironing out those driving tools and getting a good setup for the SQ1 and SQ2 on the medium. Qualify for the race, do your race, your sprint race that is, to get your data on the medium, and then do your main race. Let's take a look at the results together then for the practice session. And it was Lando Norris who topped it, from Leclerc, Piastri, Hamilton. Again, Piastri made that error into the last corner, didn't he, on his flying lap? You can see if we look at the sectors, he was 2/10 down on Norris in the first sector. That's a blistering first sector, by the way, from Lando. Fairly equal in the middle sector. And it was the last sector where Piastri made his mistake. So again, to my point, why are we thinking about car setup changes in the first 15 minutes when Piastri's making a mistake in the final corner? That is way more important. That's the low-hanging fruit, guys. In this 60-minute FP1 session, the low-hanging fruit is getting up to speed and getting comfortable as quickly as possible. Russell in there, he didn't manage to go quicker on the soft compound tire, which was really interesting. Surprises again with these guys, Hulkenberg, Albon getting in there. It looked like Verstappen struggled a bit. I didn't quite follow if he made a mistake on his lap or if they're genuinely lacking for pace. So that's probably the biggest call out. Let's have a look at the top speeds together now as well. And here are the top speeds. Really interesting to see that Russell and Antonelli are topping it in the Mercedes, 340 and 338 respectively, and that they were struggling with blistering. So that's kind of interesting. So they've got heaps of top line speed and they're overworking the tires. Generally, those two don't go hand in hand. Normally, it's the car with the most downforce and putting the most load and maybe overheating the tire the most. That's the one that's going to stress that and Maybe Kimi did an exceptionally long run on that compound and it eventually led to the blistering. I'm not sure. Interesting to see, though. This is a strength of those cars. Verstappen up there 336. And I think from here, 336 to 332, there's not that much in it. So these guys are kind of hanging around that mid pack. I'd probably call out Russell and Antonelli as the outliers. The two McLarens, similar to what we saw in Melbourne, not necessarily with killer top end in that practice session, but with a plenty of front grip. And we said that the McLaren's got a lot of cards that can play. It can play the front grip card. It can play the traction card. It can play the tire management card. And then these guys probably want to look at trimming a little bit of wing off. Sainz doing, we're not sure. Obviously, he didn't get his final running at the end, so he would be up where Gasly is. So I think it's just these guys, the V-Carbs and the Williamses and Behrman as well, I guess. I'm not sure if he got a full running in, but probably the V-Carbs want to clean up their top end, but that is some killer top end from the Mercedes guys. Be interesting to see how that race car goes in the sprint race tomorrow. Let's talk about sprint qualifying now. And my general overarching theme is that there was pace in that Ferrari. There always was pace in that Ferrari in Melbourne. But for some reason, I feel like they did do some divergence in terms of ride height and suspension settings for the weather, predicting for the weather, like that it was going to rain and it was going to help their chances on Sunday. That's my intuition, is that they went in that direction on Saturday for qualifying. And like I said before, the night before in the preview, I wouldn't be doing this because you're going to compromise your qualifying position. It's going to be hard to pass those cars come Sunday. And if it does dry out in the race, you're now got a wet setup on a dry track. It's never going to work out in that situation. So what happened? That's exactly what happened. I think they went in the wet setup and it just didn't work out for them. So now we're starting to see the true pace of the car and we're starting to see the cream rise to the top. Now, like I said in the intro, I thought at one point Hamilton will get the upper hand on Leclerc. If the car is championship worthy car, I'd be hard pressed to see a situation where Leclerc is taking a championship off Hamilton. That's going to be very difficult to do. If he's happy with the car, that's going to be a challenge. Now, if the Ferrari is not a championship winning car, different story. Maybe Leclerc will get the upper hand. But anyway, here we go. Hamilton on pole. Let's take a look at the Q1 results. And you can already start to see Hamilton just feeling comfortable, feeling at home here. With the best last two sectors, this was the general theme of the qualifying session, was that Hamilton had the best last two sectors and Lando had the best first sector. Remember, the first sector is that long corner with all the front grip. And the last two sectors, it's really about your high-speed entry and traction as well. Traction out of the hairpin, the final corner. Traction out of the square, the chicane as well. And traction out of turn 6, the tight right-hander as well. So it's traction. So good to see that Ferrari's got good traction. That's my key takeaway from this whole session. Anyway, the guys that got kicked out were doing Gasly, Ocon, Hulkenberg, and Lawson. Interesting comment from Liam Lawson as he comes around. He goes on the radio, "Sorry, I couldn't get the tires down," suggesting that he couldn't get the tires down in the right temperature or pressure that he wanted during the lap or before the lap. And this points to exactly what I spoke to, guys, just when I was analyzing the practice. There's no point doing your long runs if you're going to not make it into SQ2 and SQ3. Your long runs are secondary to where you're going to qualify. That is, if you can't work out how to switch on these mediums or not switch them on or manage them over one lap, the whole thing is pointless. So I'm not sure what run plan they did, Red Bull, but if they did like what I suspect they did, like what everyone did, you get what you deserve if you don't understand how to use the medium compound over one lap. A very different proposition in how to use the medium compound over a race. And here you're being assessed on its one lap performance. So he's there in 20. His comment was, "I couldn't get the tires down." And if you don't practice it, how are you gonna understand it? That's the first thing on Liam. The second thing is he's still hacking away at the steering wheel into turn 1 as well. I definitely don't like that style. I spoke about this in Melbourne. He doesn't turn the steering wheel in with one nice sweeping motion like Max and always just raising, a little bit more, kind of adding. Liam, really says get into the corner and it's not working for him. I said in Melbourne, he really needs to chop that out of his game. And it's a very unorthodox style. I've never seen anyone drive like that since Alonso in 2005 with the Renault, like that much initial steering input. So Liam just needs to drive more elegantly, more patiently, more beautifully to keep aerodynamics and vehicle dynamic platform stable. I'm still seeing him enter with like hack away at the steering wheel. I don't like what I see. Interesting to see Doohan out-qualify Gasly. I thought Doohan put together a great weekend in Melbourne other than the rain. Obviously, he built a weekend. He didn't make any mistakes in practice. In Q1, I think he out-qualified Gasly as well. In Q2, you guys saw my telemetry analysis in Melbourne. He was on par with Pierre until he got the yellow flags for Hamilton. So in the dry, Mick's been doing a great job, I think. It was just in the wet in Melbourne, that critical error, not opening up the steering wheel, which is something you really need to do in the wet. But seems like he's pretty comfortable with that car in dry conditions. He's either matching Pierre or in this case, slightly quicker. Another interesting call out was that Ocon and Hulkenberg got out qualified by their less experienced teammates in Bortoleto and Behrman. That's quite a surprise because Ocon and Hulkenberg, I for one, rate quite well. So to see them out and out qualified by Bortoleto and Behrman is strange. And I'm not sure if that speaks to the quality of Behrman or Bortoleto or speaks to the mistakes of Ocon and Hulkenberg. At this stage, I'm not sure. But I wanted to call that out as being a very insightful Q1 session. SQ2 this time was topped by Lando. And if you look at the best sectors, it's the same sort of theme going on here. Lando always with that 2/10 in the first sector. And then in the traction sectors, Hamilton really starting to take advantage of the traction. We went on board with him actually through the final corner, Hamilton. And just the way he was able to apply the throttle was perfect. Like he could put it down hard. The car didn't step out. It's things that I've been saying on this channel. Let Ferrari build you a good racing car, but you need to do the racing operations yourself. So this is where I think the championship will be won and lost, honestly. The Ferrari guys and girls at Maranello can build a decent car. It's evident here in the traction capability of the car. But come race day, race operations, you're talking about the race engineers, the strategy. That's where the Ferrari kind of circus starts and ends. And that's where I think Hamilton's going to need to firstly get accustomed to this car and how to drive it, which he seems to be doing okay. But in the second instance, drag it forward to the race. I know that's not relevant to SQ2, but I thought I'd talk about that now as I see the purple sectors flashing up. The next step is going to be race operations and race management. Bortoleto and Hadjar in the SQ2, again, coming unstuck at turn 1. That is making mistakes at turn 1, taking that really wide line through there. And it was really interesting, just while we're talking about turn 1 and the tight line, Lewis is the only one pretty much all weekend that hasn't stepped out at turn 1. Might give him a commentator's curse for that tomorrow, but so far so good. And I think it is because if Lewis is given the option to go out wide and cut back in or take a tighter line and put less load on the car, Lewis will choose the tight line each and every single time. And that's why I think he's had a very consistent car into turn 1. That could be why also he's got traction capability at the back end of the circuit as well, because he's not overloading the rear tires in turns 1 and 2. Maybe we see Leclerc doing that as well. And that could be having implications later on in the lap as well. An interesting comment from George Russell in this session on his first run. Guys, he comes on the radio and goes, guys, the tires just aren't working. It's both axles, just no grip. Again, we spoke about this. If you're not practicing your one lap performance on the medium tire in your only practice session, don't be surprised when these things come up, you know, same sort of thing as we spoke about in SQ1. Here are the results then from SQ3. It's Hamilton on pole, a 30.8. It's Max Verstappen in P2. This is where the champions make the difference, because look where Norris is, P6. So yes, Norris did a fantastic job in Melbourne, but a mistake here and lock up into the hairpin has cost him a shot at pole, really, because have a look how mega his first sector is. He's already got 2.6 tenths on Lewis in the first sector, but a mistake at the hairpin, you know, is already going to have points implications and going to cost him points. Whereas Max is there second. If he can just collect seconds throughout the year, Max, you know, can definitely win this championship by definitely not having the best car, but just by being there every single time. This was an example in that Max is there right alongside Lewis. He's actually got the best final sector. So I think it highlights you know, the cream rising to the top. Hamilton getting comfortable with this car, taking advantage of it. Verstappen making the most of his car, taking advantage of it and showing his class and consistency. I think it's clear in this era that Max is the best driver on the grid. Good to see Piastri at least complete a lap and get in there. He won't be happy with that though, particularly with the 2/10 to Lando. He's going to be wondering, where is that time? If I do get a chance to look at the telemetry and it's available, I will try to answer that question. Where is the 2/10 that Lando keeps finding on Oscar in turn 1? And it was interesting to see as well, Antonelli turning 3 times into turn 2, turn 1, the long turn 1 that heads into turn 2. He's turned in once, got the oversteer, tried to turn in again, correct the oversteer, tried to turn in again and correct the oversteer. Again, it's all a function of the line, I think. If you can just come in a little bit tighter and turn less, it's going to make your life easier, guys. So unfortunately, they're not aware of the tight line. It's something that only the pole sitter is aware of as it stands. Lewis Hamilton is the only tight line merchant on the grid, and he lines up pole for the sprint race tomorrow. If we just have a look at the telemetry between the top 2 drivers, Hamilton, Verstappen, you can really get an insight into the entry-exit style of Hamilton versus Verstappen. Even the track dominance will show you here. If I just zoom in, all of the entries like turn 1 are red, but then the exit is blue. Entry to turn 6 is red. Entries are red. Entry to braking is red here, and the entry into the hairpin is red here, and then Max on the exit. So if you guys don't believe me that Hamilton is the tight line and Max is totally the opposite and that sort of thing, it's here to see as well. It's supported by fact here. And if you look at the delta, anytime it jumps up, that's in Hamilton's favor. So that's Hamilton finding the time on the entry to the corner and Max getting it back on the exit. Hamilton finding time again on the entry and Max getting it back on the exit. Here's the only time it didn't work out for Lewis, and I think that's into the hairpin. He finds a little bit of time on entry, but I think it's Max with the better throttle introduction. It is into the hairpin and the final corner as well, I believe. So that last sector there, I think Max did a great job, kept his rear tires in and found some traction. But up to that point, he was 2/10 behind. So Hamilton he really is taking advantage of the entries here, and he must be super comfortable with the braking setup and the rear stability of that car. They must have dialed that out quickly in the practice session. Yeah, there's nothing more to say than that. This is a great example that highlights the different styles of the 2 drivers, and we're going to have to see Max now looking after the front left in the race tomorrow. So looking ahead, guys, a really fascinating session, and here's what I'll be looking out for. It's going to be the front left tire life over the course of the sprint race, and who can look after and manage that the best. Hamilton has the advantage not only because he's in pole position, but because he is the only tight line driver on the grid. He can drive less meters, put less load on the outside front, look after that tire a lot better, and so he has to be the favorite going into the sprint. And Max, who's the total opposite of that, plus he's got the dirty air as well. What I'm looking for here is, for how long can Max hang on, and what does Max see or learn by following Lewis as well? Can he get inside Lewis? Is he susceptible to aero wash? Does Max begin to run out of front tires before Lewis? Or can he start to form an attack on Lewis? Remember, the DRS is going to be very powerful. So there's no excuse for Max not staying in the DRS other than the fact that he drops out due to dirty air and tire life. That's going to be the story of the race for me. If Hamilton can get a good start and maintain the lead into turn 1, it's self-explanatory what needs to be done, because what needs to be done off the line is what always needs to be done off the line. Lewis needs to shoot across and get to the inside as quickly as possible and stop Max Verstappen getting up the inside and controlling turn 1 from there. If Lewis can get to the inside and Max can keep P2, I'd be happy to see a race from there, because I want to see how Max problem solves and how he deals with front tire life, how he deals with dirty air. Arguably, this is the only weakness in Max Verstappen's game, is the tight line overloading the front tires. So let's see if he can resolve for that. I'll be keen to see. And I think for all of Formula One, it'd be great to see a Hamilton win tomorrow. So let's hope he can get it done. Let's see what Lando can do with that mega pace in that McLaren as well, particularly in the first sector. I'll be interested to see if he can eventually get past maybe Russell and Leclerc and finish P4. That'll be a good result for Lando as well. He's going to have to do some damage limitation, and not make this mistake in qualifying proper tomorrow as well. Thanks for watching. If you had a thought or question, please do leave a comment for me in the comment section below. It helps the channel a lot. And smash the subscribe button for more racing analysis moving forward. Thanks for watching again. I'll see you in the next one.